66 million years ago, the sky was falling. Not metaphorically, not gradually. The sky was literally collapsing into the earth in a cascade of superheated stone and molten glass. In what is now the Yucatan Peninsula, a rock from space, 6 miles wide, traveling at 45,000 miles per hour, had just struck the planet with the force of 10 billion atomic bombs. The impact was instantaneous. The consequences would unfold over millennia. Within seconds, a crater, 93 miles across, was carved into the limestone shelf. Within minutes, a fireball larger than entire mountain ranges consumed everything within 600 miles. Within hours, tsunamis half a mile tall swept across shallow seas, drowning coastal forests that had stood for 20 million years. But the true horror was only beginning. Ejected material, trillions of tons of vaporized rock, was now screaming back into the atmosphere at terminal velocity, heating the air to oven-like temperatures across the entire planet. Forests ignited spontaneously. Animals that had survived the initial blast were now being cooked alive under open sky. In the Cretaceous swamps of what would become Montana, a small feathered creature crouched beneath the roots of a fallen conifer. No larger than a crow, its body trembled as the world above turned to fire. Its ancestors had survived ice ages, volcanic winters, and the slow tectonic drift of continents. But nothing had prepared any living thing for this. The creature's name is lost to time. Its species will never be catalogued. But in its fragile bones and hollow chest, in the precise architecture of its wings and the unique structure of its skull, it carried something the giants around it did not. A key to the future. While Tyrannosaurs suffocated in the ash-choked lowlands and armored ankylosaurs collapsed from heat exhaustion in the highlands, this small dinosaur, because that's what it was, a dinosaur, would endure the darkness to come. It would survive because of choices made by its ancestors millions of years before the asteroid ever appeared in Earth's sky. This is the story of the greatest evolutionary substitution in planetary history, the story of how one branch of the dinosaur family tree outlived all the others, how they inherited a devastated world and transformed it, how they became so successful that today they outnumber mammals 2 to 1. This is the story of how birds replaced dinosaurs, even though birds are dinosaurs. To understand what happened next, you must first understand the scale of what had just been destroyed. The Chicxulub impact released energy equivalent to 5 billion Hiroshima bombs detonating simultaneously. The initial explosion vaporized the asteroid itself, along with thousands of cubic miles of Earth's crust, sending a plume of superheated debris straight through the atmosphere and into space. Some of this material achieved escape velocity and left Earth entirely, scattering across the solar system. Some of it rained back down within hours, re-entering the atmosphere as billions of meteors, each one adding more heat to an already burning world. The temperature beneath this blanket of falling rock reached an estimated 300 degrees Celsius in some regions. Global average temperatures spiked by thousands of degrees for hours. Nothing above ground and larger than a small dog survived the initial heating pulse. But the heat was only the beginning. Within days, the ejected material that didn't fall back to Earth formed a global dust cloud so dense it blocked 99% of sunlight. Photosynthesis ceased across the entire planet. The base of the food chain collapsed instantly. In the oceans, Phytoplankton died en masse. Without these microscopic organisms producing oxygen and nutrients, the marine food web disintegrated from the bottom up. Ammonites, which had ruled the seas for 350 million years, went extinct within months. Marine reptiles, mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, starved in dark waters. On land, plants wilted and died. Herbivorous dinosaurs, some weighing as much as 70 tons, found nothing to eat. Their metabolisms, optimized for processing enormous quantities of vegetation, became death sentences. A sauropod needed to consume hundreds of pounds of plant matter daily. When the plants died, so did they. And when the herbivores died, the carnivores followed. The darkness lasted between 6 months and 2 years, depending on latitude. When sunlight finally returned, the world it illuminated was unrecognizable. 75% of all species on Earth had been erased. Every non-avian dinosaur gone. Pterosaurs gone. Most crocodilians gone. Large marine reptiles gone. Ammonites gone. Countless species of plants, insects, mammals, and fish gone. The Cretaceous world, with its towering giants and flowering forests, its inland seas and humid jungles, had been replaced by something darker, quieter, emptier, but not lifeless. Imagine standing in what was once a thriving forest ecosystem in North America, just months after impact. The canopy is gone. Massive tree trunks lie scattered like matchsticks, their bark stripped away, their wood bleached white by acid rain. The soil, once rich with organic matter and teeming with invertebrates, is now sterile gray ash. No insects hum, no leaves rustle. The silence is profound. In the Cretaceous, this landscape would have been dominated by hadrosaurids, duck-billed dinosaurs that moved in herds thousands strong, their calls echoing through river valleys. Ceratopsians would have browsed the lower vegetation, their elaborate frills and horns flashing in dappled sunlight. Overhead, pterosaurs with wingspans exceeding fighter jets would have ridden thermal currents. All of them are dead now. Their bodies lie where they fell, partially buried in ash, their bones already beginning the long process of fossilization that will one day allow humans to reconstruct their final moments. Some skeletons show evidence of trauma from the impact itself. Others simply starved in the months that followed. The food web had been built on abundance. Flowering plants had evolved rapidly during the Cretaceous, creating diverse understories that supported equally diverse communities of insects, which in turn supported small mammals, lizards, and yes, birds. Large herbivores sustained populations of apex predators like Tyrannosaurus rex. But this system had no redundancy. It was optimized for a stable climate and predictable resources. The asteroid shattered that stability in an afternoon. What remained were survivors clinging to the edges of possibility. In the ash-covered wasteland, certain organisms had advantages the dominant species did not. Size suddenly mattered, but in reverse. Being small meant needing less food, less water, less territory. Being able to eat seeds rather than fresh vegetation meant accessing calories that could remain viable for months or years. Being able to fly meant reaching scattered resources across devastated landscapes. And being able to regulate body temperature independently of the environment meant surviving temperature swings that would kill cold-blooded creatures within hours. The survivors were not the strongest, not the most numerous, not the most specialized. They were the most flexible. In the aftermath, certain patterns emerged among the survivors. Small-bodied organisms survived at higher rates than large ones. Aquatic and semi-aquatic organisms survived better than purely terrestrial ones. Generalist feeders survived better than specialists. Organisms capable of dormancy, whether as seeds, spores, or eggs, survived better than those requiring continuous active metabolism. But among the dinosaurs, only one group made it through. The avian dinosaurs, not all of them. The Cretaceous sky had been full of bird diversity: toothed birds, flightless birds, shorebirds, forest birds, dozens of lineages representing millions of years of evolutionary experimentation. Most of them died, but a specific subset survived. A group paleontologists now call neonethes. The crown group of modern birds, these were relatively small, likely capable of sustained flight, and crucially, they possessed something their cousins did not: beaks. Not teeth and beaks, just beaks. The seemingly minor detail would prove decisive. Teeth are expensive. In terms of development, in terms of calcium requirements, in terms of structural maintenance. A jaw full of teeth meant a dietary commitment. Carnivores had sharp teeth, herbivores had grinding teeth, and changing from one to the other required millions of years of evolution. But a beak was different. A beak was a multi-purpose tool. The same basic structure could crack seeds, strip bark, probe mud for invertebrates, tear flesh, filter water for plankton. Slight variations in shape and size opened entirely different ecological niches without requiring fundamental restructuring of the skull. When plant matter became scarce, beaked birds could switch to seeds. When fresh prey disappeared, they could scavenge. When both were unavailable, they could move, fly hundreds of miles to regions where the ash had settled differently, where isolated pockets of life persisted. Their toothed relatives couldn't make these adjustments. They were locked into specific diets by the very structures that had made them successful before the impact. There was something else. The survivors were likely ground-dwelling or semi-terrestrial, rather than fully arboreal. When the forests burned, canopy-dwelling species had nowhere to go. But birds comfortable on the ground could shelter in burrows, in rock crevices, beneath debris. And they were likely omnivorous or insectivorous, rather than purely herbivorous or carnivorous. In a world where food webs had collapsed, the ability to eat anything became the difference between extinction and survival. One study analyzing the fossil record suggests that all modern bird lineages descended from ground-dwelling ancestors who survived the impact by sheltering at ground level and feeding on seeds in the immediate aftermath. The skies emptied, but the ground held secrets. For 160 million years, dinosaurs had ruled Earth with uncontested dominance. They had evolved to fill every conceivable ecological niche on land. The largest animals ever to walk the Earth were dinosaurs. The fastest land animals were dinosaurs. The most successful herbivores, carnivores, omnivores, all dinosaurs. Mammals existed during this entire period, but they remained small, shrew-like, nocturnal, confined to the margins of ecosystems dominated by reptilian giants. In the Cretaceous, the average dinosaur was the size of a turkey. The average mammal was the size of a mouse. The asteroid changed that calculation permanently. Suddenly, being large was a liability. Suddenly, The ecological niches that had been controlled by dinosaurs for 100 million years were vacant. Suddenly, the survivors, small birds, small mammals, lizards, amphibians, crocodilians, found themselves in a world with no competition from above. The power shift began immediately. Within the first million years after impact, an eye blink in geological time, birds began to diversify at rates never before seen in their lineage. Free from predation by pterosaurs and large theropod dinosaurs, free to experiment with body plans and feeding strategies, they radiated into hundreds of new forms. Some remained small and became specialized seed eaters, developing crushing beaks and powerful jaw muscles. Others grew larger and took on predatory roles, developing hooked beaks and talons. Still others adapted to aquatic environments, developing webbed feet and waterproof plumage. But birds weren't alone in this expansion. Mammals, too, began to diversify. Within 10 million years of the impact, the first truly large mammals appeared. Primitive ungulates the size of sheep, early primates, ancestors of carnivorous groups, they were testing the same empty niches birds were exploring. A competition was beginning. For the next several million years, it was unclear who would win. Birds had a head start. They were already diverse and widespread at the time of impact. They could fly, which gave them unparalleled ability to disperse and colonize new territories. They had already evolved complex behaviors, sophisticated nesting strategies, and in some cases, rudimentary social structures. But mammals had advantages of their own. They gave birth to live young, which could be protected and nurtured rather than laid in vulnerable nests. They produced milk, allowing them to feed offspring in environments where food was scarce. And they had placental development, which meant faster maturation times. The outcome would depend on factors neither group could control: climate, geography, chance, and one more thing: which group could evolve faster? 10 million years after the asteroid impact, Earth in the Paleocene epoch was a planet in transition. The scars were still visible. Asteroid debris still circled the globe in faint rings visible at dawn and dusk. Impact winter had given way to unstable warming. Volcanism, triggered by the massive seismic shocks of the collision, continued to pump greenhouse gases into the recovering atmosphere. But life had returned. Forests were growing again. Not the same forests, and not with the same trees, but green nonetheless. Ferns dominated the understory, as they always do after catastrophic disturbances. Flowering plants were adapting, evolving new strategies for a world without their Cretaceous pollinators. And in the canopy, in the undergrowth, along coastlines and riverbanks, birds were everywhere. They had done something remarkable, something that would define the next 65 million years of planetary history. They had replaced themselves, or rather, they had taken over the roles their non-avian cousins once filled. In South America, a lineage of birds called forest racids, the terror birds, had evolved into apex predators. Standing 10 feet tall, with massive hooked beaks capable of crushing bone and powerful legs that could run down prey at high speeds, they filled the niche left vacant by tyrannosaurs. These were not scavengers. These were active hunters. Pack hunters in some species. They pursued primitive mammals across open grasslands, their heads bobbing with each stride, their eyes tracking motion with predatory precision that would have been familiar to any velociraptor. For 20 million years, terror birds were the dominant predators in South America. Mammals evolved in their shadow, developing speed and defensive adaptations specifically to avoid avian predation. In other regions, different bird lineages took different paths. Gastonis, a massive flightless bird in Europe and North America, may have been herbivorous, a rare strategy for birds, but one that worked in forests still recovering from the extinction. Some paleontologists suggest they were omnivores, crushing bones and plant matter with equal efficiency. Smaller raptorial birds evolved into diverse hunting specialists. Some became fish specialists, developing spear-like beaks and diving techniques. Others became insectivores, with thin probing beaks and rapid metabolisms. Still others became aerial predators, the ancestors of modern hawks and eagles, perfecting the art of the stoop, the high-speed dive that remains one of nature's most effective killing techniques. And in the oceans, birds were experimenting too. Penguins appeared early in the Paleocene, abandoning flight for underwater pursuit of fish. Their wings became flippers, their bones became denser, their feathers became waterproof armor against cold Antarctic seas. Some early penguin species stood as tall as a human and hunted in waters where mosasaurs once reigned. Diversification was happening at every level, at every scale, in every environment. By 30 million years after the impact, birds had achieved something no other group could match. They had colonized every continent, every major biome, every altitude from sea level to mountain peaks. They had evolved into species that never flew, and species that never landed, species that hunted and species that grazed, species that sang and species that were silent. More than 10,000 species existed by the Eocene epoch, and they were still evolving. But the Paleogene was not a stable time. Earth's climate, still recovering from the impact, went through violent oscillations that would have tested even the most adaptable organisms. 56 million years ago, a catastrophic event called the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum occurred. Global temperatures spiked by 5 to 8 degrees Celsius in less than 20,000 years. An eye blink in geological time, but long enough to fundamentally restructure ecosystems. The cause remains debated. Massive volcanic eruptions, methane release from melting ocean flow hydrates, orbital variations, likely all three acting in concert. The consequences were clear. Ice caps melted, sea levels rose. Tropical forests spread to latitudes that had been temperate. Deserts expanded in continental interiors. Ocean chemistry changed, becoming more acidic, causing mass die-offs of carbonate shell organisms. Species that couldn't adapt went extinct. Species that could migrate did. Species that could evolve rapidly survived. Birds did all three. Their ability to fly meant they could track shifting habitat zones faster than any terrestrial organism. When forests expanded northward, forest birds followed within generations. When wetlands dried up, aquatic birds simply flew to new wetlands hundreds of miles away. But this constant movement also drove evolutionary innovation. Populations became isolated. Island groups, separated by rising seas, developed unique characteristics. Mountain species, pushed higher by warming lowlands, adapted to thinner air and colder temperatures. Desert specialists evolved better heat tolerance and water conservation. The PE team lasted about 200,000 years. When it ended, global cooling began. Ice returned to the poles, forests retreated, grasslands expanded, and birds adapted again. This climatic instability, warming, cooling, wetting, drying, created what evolutionary biologists call a diversification pump. Each climate shift eliminated some species while creating opportunities for others. Each oscillation reshuffled the deck, allowing new combinations of traits to be tested against new environmental conditions. Mammals were going through the same process. They too were diversifying rapidly, taking advantage of the same empty niches and unstable conditions. Competition intensified. In the Eocene, the first primates appeared in tropical forests, competing with birds for fruit and insects. The first bats appeared, competing with birds for nocturnal insect hunting. The first large mammalian carnivores appeared, competing with terror birds for apex predator status. The question was no longer whether birds would survive. The question was whether they could maintain their dominance. 30 million years after the asteroid impact, the map of life on Earth had been completely redrawn. Birds had not simply survived. They had fundamentally altered the course of evolution on the planet. Consider the ripple effects of their success. By evolving into such diverse forms and occupying so many ecological niches, birds created selection pressures that shaped the evolution of other groups. Mammals evolved better hearing to detect avian predators. Insects evolved better camouflage to avoid avian insectivores. Plants evolved new seed dispersal strategies that relied on bird consumption and transportation. Entire ecosystems now depended on bird behaviors, seed dispersal, pollination, insect population control, carrion removal, nutrient cycling through guano deposits. Some islands, colonized by flightless birds after the extinction, became entirely bird-dominated ecosystems with no native mammals except bats. New Zealand would remain this way until human arrival, a glimpse of what Earth might have looked like if birds, not mammals, had won the competition for global dominance. But there were costs to their success. The same traits that allowed birds to diversify so rapidly also made them vulnerable to certain changes. Flight required hollow bones and high metabolisms. High metabolisms required constant food intake. Constant food intake meant vulnerability to resource disruption. When the climate stabilized in the Oligocene, about 30 million years ago, some of these vulnerabilities became apparent. Grasslands were expanding across continents as forests retreated and global temperatures cooled. This was ideal habitat for large grazing mammals, ancestors of horses, rhinoceroses, elephants. These mammals could process low-quality vegetation efficiently with specialized gut bacteria and long digestive times. Birds couldn't compete with this. A few lineages became grazers, but most birds lacked the digestive adaptations necessary to extract enough calories from grass. The giant flightless predatory birds began to decline as well. Mammals were evolving into larger, more sophisticated predators, early cats, dogs, bears. These mammalian carnivores had advantages in sustained pursuit and cooperative hunting that even terror birds couldn't match. By 20 million years ago, the balance had shifted. Mammals were now the dominant large land animals. The age of giant birds was ending. Terror birds would persist in South America until just 2 million years ago, but they were no longer unchallenged. But birds didn't fade away. They adapted again. Unable to dominate on the ground, they refined their mastery of the air. Passerines, perching birds, songbirds, underwent explosive diversification in the Miocene. These small, agile, highly intelligent birds developed complex vocalizations, sophisticated social behaviors, and remarkable cognitive abilities. They became the most successful vertebrate group on the planet in terms of species diversity. Today, there are more than 10,000 species of birds, more than any group of land vertebrates except fish. They live on every continent, in every biome, from pole to pole. They are dinosaurs who learned to fly, and in doing so, they survived an extinction that killed everything else with their name. Understanding why birds survived when other dinosaurs did not requires understanding the nature of extinction events as evolutionary filters. Mass extinctions don't kill randomly. They select against specific traits and in favor of others, often in ways that have nothing to do with how successful those traits were before the catastrophe. Being large and powerful, traits that made tyrannosaurs and sauropods successful for millions of years, became death sentences when food disappeared and temperatures fluctuated wildly. Being specialized, having teeth shaped for specific foods, metabolisms tuned to specific climates, meant inflexibility when everything changed at once. Being abundant, a sign of evolutionary success in normal times, meant nothing when the base of the food chain collapsed. The filter selected for opposite traits: small body size, generalist diets, metabolic flexibility, ability to enter dormancy or torpor, ability to move quickly across long distances. Birds possessed most of these traits, not because they were preparing for an asteroid impact. Evolution doesn't work that way. But because their ancestors had evolved these traits for entirely different reasons millions of years earlier. Flight evolved in theropod dinosaurs probably for display, for hunting, or for escaping predators. Feathers evolved for insulation and signaling. High metabolisms evolved to power active hunting and sustained flight. Beaks evolved perhaps for specialized feeding or nest building. None of these adaptations were designed for surviving impact winter. But when the asteroid came, they became survival traits. This is the paradox of mass extinctions. They punish success and reward accident. They eliminate lineages that were perfectly adapted to the world before, and they elevate lineages that just happened to have the right combination of traits for the world after. Birds were lucky, but they were also prepared by the accumulated legacy of their evolutionary history. Their theropod ancestors had been experimenting with feathers for 100 million years before the impact. They had been refining flight mechanics for tens of millions of years. They had been developing high-performance metabolisms and complex behaviors for even longer. When the moment came, all of that experimentation paid off. The non-avian dinosaurs had no such luck. Their evolutionary paths had taken them towards size, toward specialization, toward dominance in stable ecosystems. When stability shattered, so did they. The recovery was not quick. For the first 100,000 years after impact, Earth was a wasteland. The survivors huddled in scattered refugia, isolated pockets where conditions remained just barely habitable. Genetic diversity plummeted as populations crashed. Ecosystems simplified down to their most basic components. But life is resilient in ways that defy comprehension. Seeds that had lain dormant in ash-covered soil began to germinate when conditions improved. Spores carried on the wind found new ground and sprouted. Fish that had survived in deep ocean trenches repopulated shallow seas. Insects emerged from underground cocoons, and birds began to spread. Slowly at first, a few species expanding their ranges. A few populations growing large enough to split and diversify. Then faster, by 1 million years, post-impact recognizable bird families were emerging. Waterfowl, shorebirds, early land birds. By 5 million years post-impact, the major radiation was underway. Every year brought new species, new adaptations, new ecological experiments. By 10 million years, the world was green again. Not the same green, but alive nonetheless. The ecosystems that emerged from the extinction were different from what came before. Flowering plants, freed from the browsing pressure of giant herbivores, diversified explosively. Grasslands appeared for the first time. Deciduous forests spread across temperate zones, and birds were woven into every part of this new world. They pollinated flowers that had evolved specifically for avian pollination. They dispersed seeds across distances that would have been impossible without flight. They controlled insect populations that would have otherwise exploded without larger predators. In evolutionary terms, they didn't just survive the extinction. They became essential to the world that followed. This is perhaps the deepest lesson of the KPG extinction. Survival is not enough. The true test comes after. Whether a group can adapt to the new normal, whether it can find roles in ecosystems that didn't exist before, whether it can evolve into forms that exploit opportunities the old world never offered. Birds passed that test. They became so integrated into Paleogene and Neogene ecosystems that removing them would have collapsed food webs across the planet. By the time humans evolved, 65 million years after the asteroid impact, birds were everywhere. In myths and stories, in skies and forests, in the background noise of every habitable environment on Earth. We evolved in a world shaped by their survival. Stand outside at dawn and listen. The sounds you hear, the calls, the songs, the wing beats, are echoes of the Cretaceous. Every bird you see is a dinosaur. Not descended from dinosaurs, not related to dinosaurs. They are dinosaurs. Their bones are hollow because theropod bones were hollow. Their feathers are modified scales because theropod scales were modified for insulation. Their high metabolisms are inherited from hunting ancestors who chased prey through Jurassic forests. When a hawk stoops on a rabbit, it's using the same predatory instincts that guided Velociraptor. When a hummingbird hovers at a flower, it's demonstrating flight control that took 50 million years to evolve. When a crow solves a puzzle, it's using intelligence that emerged in the dinosaur brain structure millions of years before the asteroid ever arrived. The extinction did not end the age of dinosaurs. It transformed it. The giants fell. The specialists perished. The dominant lineages collapsed, but one branch, small, flexible, accidentally prepared, endured the fire and the darkness and the centuries of hunger that followed. They inherited a broken world and remade it. They diversified into thousands of forms, filled thousands of niches, spread to every corner of the planet. They proved that survival is not about strength. It's about adaptability. Not about dominance, but flexibility. Not about specialization, but generalization. In the grand story of life on Earth, the KPG extinction is often told as the event that ended the dinosaurs and began the age of mammals. But that's only half true. The dinosaurs never left. They just got smaller, learned to sing, learned to fly, and in the process, they became something more resilient than anything that came before. 66 million years ago, an asteroid killed a world, but it didn't kill the future. The future had wings. The next time you see a bird, take a moment. Look at the structure of its feet. Those are theropod feet. Look at the way it moves its head. That's how a small dinosaur would have scanned for threats. Look at its eyes, descended from hunters who tracked prey by motion and color in Mesozoic twilight. You're looking at a living connection to a world that ended in fire, a survivor of the greatest catastrophe in the history of complex life, a creature that carries in its DNA the memory of apocalypse and the promise of endurance. Birds are not a replacement for dinosaurs. They are the dinosaurs who learned to replace themselves, who adapted when adaptation seemed impossible, who found a way forward when every path seemed to lead to extinction. In their survival, there is a lesson. The world changes, sometimes gradually, sometimes in a single afternoon. What matters is not the strength you possessed in the old world. What matters is the flexibility you bring to the new one. If you found meaning in this story, share it. Let others see the deep time narrative written in feathers and bone. And the next time you hear birdsong at dawn, remember, you are listening to the voice of the Cretaceous, still singing, still here, still evolving.